A quiet day in New England. The life of Elias Thorne. The light hadn't yet broken through the trees, but Elias Thorne was already awake. He did not rise quickly. He never did. The bed was not soft, but it was familiar, and the blanket that covered him was heavy with the damp cold of New England morning. Somewhere in the dark above the beams of the ceiling, a beam creaked, expanding ever so slightly as the wood adjusted to the air. It was a sound Elias had heard countless times before. He did not think of it as noise, but as presence. The house speaking to itself, or to him, or to no one. He shifted slowly, not because his body hurt, though it often did, but because fast movement felt wrong before the sun. He sat on the edge of the bed and let his feet find the floor, rough with worn wood. His boots waited near the hearth, where the fire had long since died down to cold ash. He hadn't rekindled it last night. He remembered thinking he would, but then there had been the rain and the quiet, and his eyes had grown too heavy. He stood, reaching for the flannel he'd hung from the peg by the door. It was stiff with cold and smelled faintly of smoke. Outside, the trees whispered with a wind that had not yet gathered strength. The world, it seemed, was still considering whether or not to begin. The room was small, though Elias never thought of it that way. It had a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a corner cabinet where he kept the plate and the cup and the folded cloth. That was all he needed, sometimes more than he needed. He knelt near the hearth and began placing wood atop the old ash. Not much, just enough for a morning flame. The logs were split 2 days before and had waited beside the wall. He arranged them with care, not for perfection, but for rhythm. One piece, then another, then the kindling, then the spark struck from flint. The first crackle came soft, hesitant, then again, until a flame took shape, orange and low, curling upward like breath. He sat back and watched it grow, his arms resting on his knees. The heat was slow to come, but it would. It always did. He watched the edges of the flame lick at the bark. Sparks shifted in the ash. A quiet dance, barely heard. The light through the window began to change, just slightly. Not enough to name as day, but enough to know it was coming. He took a long breath through his nose, holding it a moment, then let it go. The morning would move forward whether he rushed or not. So he did not rush. Elias Thorne stood slowly, bones clicking softly like tools being returned to a wooden box. The fire had begun to breathe, curling brighter as the wind outside sighed across the eaves. He walked carefully toward the door, boots tapping against the creaking boards. The sounds of the house were familiar, not creaky in the sense of disrepair, but in the sense of age. Things well used, well shaped, and well settled. Like him, he reached for the woolen shawl hanging from the hook and draped it across his shoulders. It itched, but he didn't mind. He took it as part of the routine, the daily discomforts that came and went like the seasons. He reached for the wooden door latch and paused, listening to the morning. There was no bird song yet, only trees shifting, leaves whispering in that specific language they shared with no one but the wind. He stepped outside. The cold met him not with a slap, but with a slow, steady embrace. It sank through the shawl and along his spine. The cabin stood alone among thin trees that had begun to stretch after sleep. The grass was brittle, painted silver with frost. He breathed in deeply, the smell of pine, earth, distant wood smoke. Elias walked toward the stream, slow as the season allowed. His steps pressed soft indentations in the frost. The trail was one he knew so well he no longer looked at it. His thoughts were slower than his feet. He let them wander without guidance. He remembered the sound of carriages in old London, the soot, the bells, the narrow streets. And then he let it go. The stream was just past the bend where the birch tree leaned sideways. It was narrow, clear, and forever cold. Elias crouched beside it, the shawl sagging from his shoulder. He dipped one hand into the water. It bit at first, then numbed. He filled his cupped hands and drank, blinking slowly as the chill climbed behind his eyes.
The dust of morning.
He didn't say a prayer, not aloud, but he felt the rhythm of one in his chest, a habit that had outlived words. After drinking, he sat on a flat stone nearby and simply watched the water pass. Nothing in the stream rushed. Nothing argued. It just moved forward because that's what streams do. Elias watched it for what might have been minutes, might have been longer. His fingers tightened around a stick near the stone and idly traced lines in the dirt beside him. Spirals. Lines. Nothing in particular. Just the passing of a hand through earth. He would go back soon. The fire needed tending. But for now, this was enough. Elias Thorne sat before the fire and let the warmth reach him slowly, like memory, like prayer, like the slow turning of the earth he no longer felt. Elias Thorne stood slowly, bones clicking softly like tools being returned to a wooden box. The fire had begun to breathe, curling brighter as the wind outside sighed across the eaves. He walked carefully toward the door, boots tapping against the creaking boards. The sounds of the house were familiar. Not creaky in the sense of disrepair, but in the sense of age. Things well used, well shaped, and well settled. Like him, he reached for the woolen shawl hanging from the hook and draped it across his shoulders. It itched, but he didn't mind. He took it as part of the routine, the daily discomforts that came and went like the seasons. He reached for the wooden door latch and paused, listening to the morning. There was no bird song yet. Only trees shifting, leaves whispering in that specific language they shared with no one but the wind. He stepped outside. The cold met him not with a slap, but with a slow, steady embrace. It sank through the shawl and along his spine. The cabin stood alone among thin trees that had begun to stretch after sleep. The grass was brittle, painted silver with frost. He breathed in deeply, the smell of pine, earth, distant wood smoke. Elias walked toward the stream, slow as the season allowed. His steps pressed soft indentations in the frost. The trail was one he knew so well he no longer looked at it. His thoughts were slower than his feet. He let them wander without guidance. He remembered the sound of carriages in old London, the soot, the bells, the narrow streets. And then he let it go. The stream was just past the bend where the birch tree leaned sideways. It was narrow, clear, and forever cold. Elias crouched beside it, the shawl sagging from his shoulder. He dipped one hand into the water. It bit at first, then numbed. He filled his cupped hands and drank, blinking slowly as the chill climbed behind his eyes.
The dust of morning.
He didn't say a prayer, not aloud, but he felt the rhythm of one in his chest, a habit that had outlived words. After drinking, he sat on a flat stone nearby and simply watched the water pass. Nothing in the stream rushed. Nothing argued. It just moved forward because that's what streams do. Elias watched it for what might have been minutes, might have been longer. His fingers tightened around a stick near the stone and idly traced lines in the dirt beside him.
Spirals.
Lines.
Nothing in particular.
Just the passing of a hand through earth. He would go back soon. The fire needed tending. But for now, this was enough. Elias leaned back in his chair, just slightly. The back legs creaked, as they always had, uneven by no more than the thickness of a sliver. It gave the chair character, he thought. He had considered fixing it before, but never truly meant it. Some things weren't broken, just individual, the kind of thing a person learns to live with, and then prefers over time. He shifted his weight forward again and listened to the fire settle into its rhythm. The kettle had begun to sing more loudly now, not a full boil, but warm enough. He reached out with a cloth and lifted it from its hook, careful not to splash, careful not to breathe too deeply through the steam. It smelled like nothing, but warm nothing. A clean smell. A comfort. He poured the hot water into the wooden cup and set the kettle aside. There were no herbs in the water. Just heat. That was all he wanted. Something to hold. Something to sip. Something to mark the passage between morning and the next moment. He sipped it slowly, watching the steam rise. It danced in uneven trails, fading before it reached the window. The fire crackled again, louder this time, as if to announce that it, too, was awake. Elias nodded at it, not because it could see, but because it felt right to do so. He thought of the day ahead. There would be wood to stack. Maybe the roof needed checking again. He'd meant to do that last week. Or the week before. Time was flexible out here. Days folded over one another like cloth.
Nothing pressed.
Nothing shouted. He looked at the door. It was still slightly ajar from when he had returned earlier. A cool breeze slipped inside and touched the back of his neck. He didn't close it. He liked the feeling. Reminded him that the world was still turning outside, that trees moved even when he didn't see them, that air traveled whether or not it was invited. He took another sip. The warmth ran along the inside of his chest like memory, like thought that didn't need to be put into words. He chewed the rest of the bread, swallowing slowly. He looked at the chair across from him. It was empty. It had been empty for a long time, but it still faced him. That seemed enough. Elias exhaled through his nose and leaned back again. The chair creaked.
The fire whispered.
And somewhere far off, a bird began to sing. Not loud, not urgent. Just a single note, repeated, as if testing its own voice. Elias stood, slow and balanced, the floor creaking politely beneath him. The cup remained on the table, half full. He'd return to it, perhaps. Or maybe not. He walked toward the door where his tools rested, the ones he always kept near, not because he needed them every day, but because they belonged there. A hatchet with a worn handle, a short-handled broom, a square-headed hammer that had lost its edge but still held its weight. He picked up the broom and swept gently by the threshold. A morning task more for rhythm than cleanliness. Bits of bark, a single yellow leaf, one tiny stone. Each swept slowly out, each action deliberate. He leaned the broom back against the wall, exactly where it had been. His coat hung beside the tools, heavier than the shawl, lined with coarse wool that scratched at the wrist. He pulled it over his shoulders, straightened the front, and fastened 2 buttons. Not all of them, just the ones that mattered. Then, his hand paused at the small wooden peg nearby, where a hat waited. Round, brown, shaped like his father's once was. He picked it up and turned it in his hand, fingers brushing the inside brim. Then placed it gently on his head, pushing it down with a familiar motion. Outside, the frost was lifting. The sun, pale and thin, filtered softly through the trees. It gave no warmth yet, but it gave shape. The trees no longer silhouettes. They were now trees again. Elias stepped outside, pulled the door closed behind him, and heard the latch fall into place like a sigh. He walked toward the shed, not far from the cabin. The grass beneath his feet was now slightly damp, no longer crisp. The ground held the memory of frost, but not the bite. The shed leaned slightly to the left, as it always had, and the hinges made a slow, dragging sound when he opened the door. Inside, the scent of soil, wood, and something old that no longer had a name. He reached for a leather strap on the wall and looped it through his belt. The strap held a small knife, a nail, and a folded cloth. None of it needed urgently. He took them anyway. Elias didn't like to return to the shed twice in a morning. He stepped back outside and let the door close behind him. It didn't latch properly, but he gave it no attention. The shed had never truly closed. It simply waited. The fence behind the cabin had once been taller, but the years had shaved it down. Some posts leaned, others were mossy and soft to the touch. Elias ran his fingers along the top rail as he walked beside it, feeling the textures of lichen and splintered wood. A sparrow darted from one post to the next, watching him without concern. They had seen each other before. He stopped near the corner where two fence lines met, forming a quiet triangle where weeds like to grow. He knelt slowly, pressing a palm to the earth for balance. The soil was cold and damp, not the kind of ground one could plant in today, but he liked to check anyway. It was habit, not hope. His hand reached out to pull a stray vine from between the posts. It came free with a soft snap, the roots shallow and cooperative. He tossed it gently aside, where it landed without fanfare on a small pile of last year's leaves. A second sparrow joined the first. They moved without speaking, each hopping toward opposite ends of the fence before fluttering up to perch. One tilted its head.
The otter blinked slowly.
Elias watched them, then looked away, not wanting to interrupt whatever bird thoughts they might be having. He stood again, stretching slightly, the bones in his back offering a few soft protests. He turned toward the field that ran down toward the trees. It wasn't a real field, just the name he gave to the open patch between the cabin and the edge of the woods. It had never been plowed, never planted. It just existed, and that, for him, was enough to name it. A slight breeze passed, carrying the sound of tree limbs rubbing gently against one another. Elias adjusted his hat. Not because it had moved, but because the motion felt natural, something to do with his hands. He looked down at a small rock near his boot. Flat, wide, and gray. He picked it up and weighed it in his palm, then set it carefully on top of one of the fence posts, like a paperweight on something that would never blow away. The sparrows flew off, not startled, just done. Elias nodded, though he didn't know why, and turned back toward the cabin. There would be other mornings, other fences, but this one was complete, not fixed, not repaired, just seen. Elias walked toward the stand of birch trees at the edge of the clearing, his boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. The trees stood like tall white ghosts, their bark peeling in long papery curls that caught the early light. He ran his hand along the nearest trunk as he passed, the bark flaking gently under his fingertips. It made no sound. It was not meant to. The path here was narrow, used only by him and the occasional deer. Moss grew along the edges in soft patches that gave underfoot, like worn cloth. The leaves overhead whispered to each other as the breeze returned. Not a strong wind, just enough to stir the tips of the branches and remind him the world was still turning. Slowly, but turning. He stopped at a fallen log that had been there longer than he could remember. The center had begun to rot, caving in on itself with each season. Mushrooms had claimed one side, pale and quiet, like shelves in a forgotten library. Elias crouched and touched one gently with his thumb. It didn't move. He didn't expect it to.
From the other side of the path, I heard the sound of a squirrel scold in the morning.
A sharp chatter, brief and unimpressed. Elias looked in its direction, but saw only the tremble of a bush and the blur of motion. He smiled faintly, not out of amusement, but recognition. Some things never change. Squirrels would always complain. He sat on the log, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hat tilted low to keep the morning sun from his eyes. He let his gaze rest on the distant slope where trees grew closer together, darker and more private. He had walked that far before, many times, but not today. Today was not for distance. Today was for presence. A leaf drifted down from above and landed near his boot. It was brown and curled, its edges eaten by time. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers once, then let it fall again. Not every object needed to be kept. Some were best appreciated only briefly. Behind him, the cabin remained invisible. Not far, just hidden by the trees. He liked when it disappeared like that. It reminded him that he was small, and the world was larger, and that was exactly as it should be. He stayed there for a long moment, listening, not for anything in particular.
Used for the sake of listening.
As Elias rose from the log, he felt the weight of something small in his coat pocket. He reached inside and pulled out an iron nail, short, thick, darkened by time. He turned it in his fingers, watching how the light played along the dull metal. He didn't remember placing it there, but it wasn't a surprise. There were always small things tucked away in his clothing, tokens of earlier intentions. The nail was square-headed, hand-forged, probably from a barrel lid or old crate.
Not valuable,
but purposeful. He placed it back into the pocket, not because he had a plan for it, but because now he did remember. It was from the shed door, the one that never latched. He'd thought once about fixing it, perhaps today, or not. He walked back toward the cabin slowly, taking the long way around the clearing. The grass was taller here, brittle and whispering against his boots. A few dried seed pods clung to their stems, rattling faintly like old bones. He stopped to look at one, small, brown, oddly shaped, and ran his finger along its edge. It broke with a soft crack. He let it drop. Back by the side of the cabin, the stacked woodpile stood in uneven rows. He paused there, touching the topmost log with the palm of his hand. It was cold, damp near the edges. The pile would need to be rebuilt soon, realigned. He made a note of that in his mind. Not written, not spoken, just stored. Near the woodpile was a flat stone, half buried. Elias stepped onto it and stood still for a moment. From there, he could see the smoke curling softly from the chimney. Not much, just enough to signal life. He imagined the warmth still hovering near the hearth, and the breadcrumbs still on the table. He reached into his pocket again and felt the nail, warm now from the heat of his palm. He held it one more time, then crouched and placed it gently on the windowsill outside the cabin. It made a quiet sound as it landed, not sharp, not metallic.
More like a whisper.
He stared at it for a few seconds, then turned away. It would be there later, waiting, like the shed door, like the wind, like everything else in its own quiet. Elias walked past the stacked logs, his coat brushing softly against the rough bark, and made his way toward the chicken coop. It sat at the far corner of the clearing, leaning slightly to one side like it had once tried to run away, but changed its mind halfway through. The door, like the sheds, didn't close fully. It hung open a few inches even when latched. Elias didn't mind. The hens never seemed to leave. The coop was quiet this morning.
Too early for squawking.
Too early even for eggs. He pushed the door gently. It creaked in protest but gave way, and stepped inside. The smell of straw, feathers, and dust rose like a memory from the floorboards. He paused in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. One hen blinked slowly at him from her perch. Another shuffled in her nest box, feathers puffed like a woolen shawl. Elias reached for the tin scoop near the door and filled it with feed from the burlap sack on the floor. He scattered it in slow arcs, watching the grains fall in lazy spirals. One or two of the hens hopped down and pecked politely, without ceremony. He crouched in the straw, resting one elbow on his knee, and simply watched them. Their movements were deliberate, focused.
Small beaktaps against wood.
The kind of repetition that made sense. He looked up at the small window near the roof. Just a hole, really, covered in rough wire. A breeze moved through it, stirring bits of hay and feathers. Outside, the wind rustled the tall grass, and somewhere a crow called out in a voice that sounded too large for its body. He picked up a small brown egg that had rolled near the back corner and held it in both hands. It was still warm. He turned it slowly, inspecting the surface, even though he knew it would look like every other. That was part of the ritual. Each one had to be seen, had to be held. He set the egg into the wooden bowl near the door, the same bowl he'd used for 5 years. One side was cracked, but he had mended it with twine and patience. The crack didn't grow anymore. It had learned to live within its shape. As he left the coop, he closed the door behind him. It swung back slightly, as always, and he waited for it to stop moving. Then he walked on, the bowl held steady in one hand, the cold air brushing his face in soft, unbothered waves. As Elias crossed the yard toward the well, his foot nudged something solid just beneath the edge of the grass. He stopped, looked down. A stone. Flat, black, slightly too round to be natural, or perhaps too perfect to be from around here. He bent to pick it up. It was smooth, with a faint gleam when the light hit it just right. Not shiny, but different. He turned it in his palm a few times, then brushed off a bit of mud with his sleeve. The surface was cold. Not from the air, but from the earth. Stones like this remembered where they'd been. Elias felt sure of that, even if he didn't know why. He looked around. Nothing nearby to explain it. Just the ground, the grass, the path he'd walked 100 times. Had it been there before? Had he simply missed it? Or had the earth decided to show it now, today, for no reason at all? He didn't ask out loud. That wasn't his way. He carried the stone to the old stump near the well and placed it carefully on top. It sat there, still and dark, like it belonged. But he knew it didn't. And that made it feel important somehow. A reminder that even familiar places held mysteries too small to chase. He stood there a while, one hand resting on the top of the well post, eyes flicking between the stone and the trees beyond. The breeze caught the corner of his coat and made it flap once, then settle. The clouds above moved slowly, not hurried, not bored, just existing. He sat on the edge of the stump and placed the egg bowl beside him, both hands resting on his thighs. He looked down at his palms. The creases had deepened in recent years. The scars had faded, mostly, but the shape of his hands, they were still his, still familiar. From somewhere behind the cabin, he heard a thump.
Possibly a branch falling.
Or the wind against the door, or the house shifting its weight. He didn't move to check. If something had fallen, it would stay fallen. He reached out and touched the stone again, just once. Then folded his hands quietly in his lap and let the morning continue without him for a while. Elias turned slightly and looked down into the well. He didn't need water, not right now, but his eyes were drawn to the dark circle beneath the old wooden lid. The lid itself was crooked, patched with iron nails that no longer held it straight. One side dipped lower than the other, and a small tuft of moss had begun to grow where the rain always landed. The rope, thick and frayed, hung neatly coiled on the nearby hook. He touched it lightly with his fingers. It was rough, dry, stiff with time. He let the end fall free, then slowly pulled it through his hand, foot by foot, until the bucket came into view, dented wooden banded with rusted metal. He let it dangle halfway into the shaft. Not enough to fetch water, just enough to sway. The wind tugged gently at the rope, and the bucket shifted with a faint creak. He watched it twist, then return, then twist again. The pattern had no urgency, like a pendulum with nowhere to go. He sat back on the stump and let the rope slide slowly back into place, coiling it without hurry. It didn't coil perfectly, but it rested well enough. He secured it loosely on the hook again, knowing it would come loose in the next storm. It always did. Elias looked at the sky. Pale blue now, streaked with long, thin clouds that resembled old cotton. The sun was climbing slowly, casting sharper shadows between the trees. But the air was still cold, the kind of cold that lives in the ground long after the frost has lifted. He reached for the bowl again, checked the egg without knowing why, and stood. The rock remained where he'd left it. He gave it a final glance, then turned toward the path that led to the edge of the woods. He wouldn't go far. He never did. But the steps still needed taking. Elias followed the narrow path beyond the coop, past the ash tree that always dropped its leaves late, and into a shallow clearing he had visited since his arrival years ago. It wasn't large, just a dip in the land where the light broke through more freely. The grass here was thinner, mixed with patches of stone and old stumps. He stepped into the center and paused. Overhead, a hawk circled slowly, silent but watchful. Its shadow moved along the ground beside him, long and stretched, gliding across the stumps and grass like a brushstroke. Elias tilted his head slightly and followed its movement with his eyes. He didn't smile, but there was comfort in seeing it. The hawk came often. He crouched and touched a patch of moss on a low rock. The texture was cool, soft, sponge-like. He pressed his palm into it, just for the sensation. It left no mark. That pleased him, for reasons he didn't need to name. A broken branch lay near his boot. He picked it up and studied the grain. Pale wood with a curve, a split at the end. He turned it once in his hand, then snapped it cleanly in two and dropped both pieces. The sound was brief, delicate, like dry parchment tearing. He walked toward the tallest stump in the clearing, wide, darkened at the center from old rains. It had once been a maple. Now it was just a place to sit. He did so, slowly, hands resting on his knees. The hawk's shadow passed again, slower this time. The forest beyond the clearing loomed with its quiet, not threatening, just full. Full of trees, of distance, of things that didn't need to be named. Elias looked toward it, not with intention, but with stillness. He did not want to enter. He just wanted to know it was there. A few dead leaves skittered across the clearing, pushed by a lazy gust. They circled twice, then settled. He watched their path, then returned his eyes to the stump at his feet. The cracks had widened since last year. He picked at a flake of bark with one thumbnail. It peeled away easily. He held it for a moment, then let it fall. Elias remained seated on the stump, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The breeze had softened. Only the tips of the tallest trees still moved. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodpecker began its steady tapping. Not rapid, not urgent. More like a polite knocking, consistent and dull. He looked down at a piece of bark beside the stump, peeled from the base like a curled ribbon. It reminded him of the paper curls his mother used to make for holiday decorations. Back in Dorset, when the world was louder and smaller at once. He bent down slowly, picked up the bark, and turned it in his hand. Its edge was thin, dry, and flaking. When he bent it slightly, it made a faint crackling sound, the sound of something finished with holding itself together. He set it gently on his knee and studied the patterns in the wood grain. Rings and scars, swirls and ridges, a quiet language only time could write. The bark held no value, but it had history, and history, Elias believed, was worth observing.
Even in pieces.
A fly buzzed near his ear and disappeared again. He didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, but only to follow the sound. It vanished into silence like a thought forgotten mid-sentence. He dropped the bark and watched it land lightly against the edge of the stump. It bounced once, then settled. The forest offered no reaction. The hawk had gone. The tapping had stopped. Everything waited. Elias stood and brushed his hands together, though nothing clung to them. The clearing remained still. He gave it one last glance, as if to memorize the moment, not because it was remarkable, but because it existed. Then he turned back the way he came, walking slowly, his steps bending the grass rather than breaking it. The path led Elias past the shed once more, and he paused near the north wall of the cabin, where a wooden ladder rested against the siding. It had been there since last autumn, placed there with the intention of fixing a loose shingle near the roof. The ladder hadn't moved since. He touched one of the rungs with the back of his hand. It was cool, slightly warped. A spider's web stretched from the third rung to the wall, delicate and unoccupied. He admired its design, irregular, incomplete, perfect in its purpose. He looked up at the roof. The shingle was still there, still askew, still waiting. Elias thought of moving the ladder, even just a few inches, but instead he stepped back. The moment passed. At the base of the ladder, a small patch of mint had taken root, uninvited but welcome. Its scent released softly as his boot brushed one leaf. He leaned forward, broke off a stem, and rolled it between his fingers. The smell filled the air briefly. Sharp, clean, fleeting. He placed the stem behind his ear. It would stay for a while. Or not. He sat on the ground near the ladder, legs folded loosely, hands resting on his knees. From this angle, the cabin wall looked taller, older. The wood had darkened where the sun never reached. Moss ran thin lines between the boards. A nail stuck out just enough to catch a shirt sleeve, if one passed too closely. He made a note to hammer it in. But not today. He traced a knot in the siding with one fingertip, following the swirl as if it might reveal something. It didn't. But the act of tracing soothed him. A crow called out from a nearby branch, loud, abrupt, and unimpressed. Elias looked up, then nodded once, slowly, in response. The crow did not answer. It took flight instead, leaving the branch rocking gently in its wake. The wind returned with a little more purpose now, carrying with it the scent of smoke, not his own, likely from the neighbor 3 ridges east. A quiet man with a loud dog. Elias had not seen him in months. He liked it that way. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, just to feel the sun on his face. It was still weak, but it had found him at last. After a long moment of sun against closed eyes, Elias opened them slowly and stood. The weight of the day hadn't changed. It was still light, still gentle, but his knees felt the ground more than they used to. He walked toward the small bench near the side of the cabin, where an old tin bucket sat, half filled with bent and rusted nails. He hadn't touched them in months. He picked up the bucket by its thin handle and heard the soft clink of metal on metal, not loud, not sharp, but dry and tired. He placed it on the bench, sat beside it, and reached in without hesitation. The first nail he picked up was curled at the end like a hook, no longer useful for anything that required strength. He turned it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, examining its shape, admiring its failure. The second nail was straighter but coated in a layer of orange rust so fine it looked like dust. He scraped it with his thumb, revealing a sliver of dull silver beneath. He wiped his hand against his pants.
The rust left a mark like red clay.
He continued this way for some time, lifting one nail at a time, giving each its moment. Some were thick and square, some thin and twisted. One had a bit of wood still clinging to the end, a memory of where it had once lived. Elias stared at that one for longer. He didn't know what it had held together, but it had held something. When he had gone through 10 or 12 nails, he set them back into the bucket in a different order. Not organized, exactly, just returned with care, as if they might be called upon again. Or not. He leaned back on the bench, his hands resting palm down beside him. The sun reached the edge of the seat now, warming his thigh. A fly buzzed past and landed briefly on the handle of the bucket, then left again. Elias didn't follow it with his eyes. The movement of flies was not his concern today. The bench creaked beneath him as he shifted his weight.
A comforting sound. A sound of something settling into place.
He closed his eyes once more and listened to the bucket, not for any sound, but for its presence beside him. A quiet tin echo of time, stored but not forgotten. After some time, Elias rose and carried the bucket back to its corner near the door. He placed it on the same spot it had rested before. Slightly uneven ground, just enough to make the handle lean left. He didn't adjust it. Things tilted sometimes. That didn't mean they were broken. He stepped inside the cabin, closing the door gently behind him. The warmth from the earlier fire still hovered in the air, not strong but present. He removed his hat, placed it on the peg, and moved toward the window. The glass was old, imperfect, wavy in a way that made the world outside look as if it were melting into itself. A shaft of sunlight cut through at an angle, landing on the table. In the beam, dust danced, not like a storm, but like a slow snowfall made of memory. He watched the dust drift and turn, tiny flecks suspended in golden light. He lifted his hand into the beam and turned it slowly, palm up, then down. The motes moved around him, some clinging to his skin, others sliding past. He held still for a long time, watching his own fingers become part of the dust's movement. He remembered a moment like this, long ago, in a church with stained glass and silence. Dust had looked the same there. Dust didn't change, only places did. Only people. He stepped back from the window, the beam still glowing quietly behind him. The egg bowl remained on the table. He ran one finger around the rim of the bowl, slow and without aim. Then he lifted the egg again and turned it once more in his palm. He wasn't checking for cracks. He just liked the weight of it. He placed it back in the bowl and sat in the chair nearest the hearth. The fire had died down again, only a few faint embers clinging to life. He did not stir them. He only watched. Outside, the wind picked up once more, a low rush through the trees, almost like breath. The window shivered slightly in its frame. Elias didn't move. The sound reminded him of nothing, and that, in itself, was welcome. He rested his hand on the table, fingertips brushing against the edge. There was no task calling for him. No urmarkt. Only the drifting dust and the stillness of his own bones. After a while, Elias stood again and walked toward the corner of the cabin near the shelves. There, in a wooden bowl, was a small pile of unused things, objects once meant for something, now just waiting without complaint. Among them, an old hinge, detached from any door. He picked it up with both hands and turned it slowly. The metal was cold, speckled with rust, and still moved when pressed. He bent it back and forth once, listening to the quiet squeak it offered in response. Not loud, not broken, just used. He had kept it because once he'd thought he might make a box, or a cupboard, or maybe replace the hinge on the chicken coop, though he knew even then that he wouldn't. He set the hinge on the table and ran one thumb along the pin, where it had worn smooth with time. Then, with care, he closed it flat and opened it again. It was a movement without need. But still, he did it once more. He remembered finding the hinge in the dirt behind the shed, years ago. He had cleaned it with vinegar and cloth. Let it dry. Then forgotten about it. The object had not minded. He placed it back in the bowl with the others, a cracked spoon handle, a broken clasp, 2 bent nails too wide for any board. It was a collection of almosts. And Elias liked it that way. He turned to the shelves above the bowl and stared at a row of folded cloths, each one once used for something. Wiping, wrapping, dusting. Now they sat in silence. He reached for one and unfolded it slowly. It had a faint stain in one corner. Red. From berries? Paint? He couldn't recall. He ran his hand over the fabric, then folded it again, slightly neater than before. The cabin creaked overhead, not loudly, but with that specific sound of a beam reminding the roof that they were still working together. Elias looked up, nodded once, and then returned the cloth to its place. He stood still for a moment, letting the air wrap around him. It smelled of ash and wood and long-settled habits. He let his eyes rest on the hinge again. It hadn't moved. It wouldn't. Elias turned toward the front of the cabin, where the second window looked out across the path. It had no glass, only a wooden shutter, held closed with a loop of leather and a stubborn nail. He reached for the loop and let it fall free, then opened the shutter outward. It creaked slightly and swung unevenly, pausing as the breeze caught its edge. Light poured in, less direct than before, filtered by a distant stand of pine. The shadows it cast across the floor moved slowly, like thoughts beginning to form but not arriving. He watched as the shutter rocked again, now retreating, now pushing forward. The motion was without rhythm, but also without surprise. It moved the way old things move, in their own time, answering only to memory. From the window, he saw the edge of the path where moss had crept up between the stones. A squirrel darted by, stopped, looked at nothing in particular, then continued. Elias followed it with his eyes until it vanished behind the coop. He didn't wonder where it had gone. Most things went somewhere. He placed his hand on the inside edge of the shutter and pressed gently, steadying it as it swung back toward the wall. Then he released it and stepped away. The wood tapped lightly against the frame, then fell still. On the windowsill lay a small stone he had placed there months ago. Flat, gray, streaked with white. He had meant to throw it into the stream, but hadn't. He picked it up now and turned it in his fingers. It was cool and smooth, shaped like something that once mattered. He set the stone down in a new position, not for function, only for change, then turned back into the room. The sunlight had moved across the floor in the time he'd stood there. It now illuminated the edge of the hearth. Dust swirled again, slower than before, like it had grown tired of floating. Elias watched the dust, then the fire, then the shutter, which had begun to move again without invitation. He let it. Elias moved toward the back wall of the cabin, where a narrow shelf hung slightly uneven above a bench. It was held in place by two metal brackets, one newer, one rusted and bent. The shelf leaned to the right, not dramatically, but just enough that every object on it slowly shifted toward the end over time. On it sat three things: a folded map, a candle that had long since burned to the base, and a brass compass that no longer pointed north. He reached for the compass, lifting it gently as though it might protest. It didn't. The lid clicked open with a sound like a whispered memory. He stared at the needle. It quivered faintly, turning half a circle, then stopping, then starting again. He had never used it for travel. It had belonged to someone else years before, passed down, or left behind. The glass was scratched, the brass dull. Still, he liked to hold it. It reminded him that directions weren't always about destinations. He set the compass down again, this time further from the edge. A small act of resistance against gravity.
The candle now no taller than a thumb leaned against the wall.
Wax had once spilled down its side, pooling in a hardened wave along the base. He traced the edge of the wax with a fingernail, then looked away. He reached for the map and unfolded it slowly on the bench below. The creases were deep, and one corner had been patched with linen tape. The paper was yellowed, its ink faded, the rivers blurred, the towns reduced to smudges. Still, he followed one line with his finger, imagining where it once led. He paused at a curve in the road that led to nothing. He folded the map again, not perfectly, but close enough, and returned it to the shelf. It slid slightly as he let go, stopping only when it touched the candle. Elias pressed the edge of the map with one finger, just enough to straighten it, then stepped back.
The shelf creaked softly, holding everything.
Leaning, but holding. Near the hearth, resting on a low stool, sat a wooden bowl filled with small things: a button with no shirt, a piece of twine tied into a loop, a pebble the color of ash, and a single feather. Elias knelt beside it, knees cracking softly as he settled. He reached for the feather first, light gray, stiff at the base, soft at the tip. It curved naturally, as if shaped by a breeze. He held it upright, letting it balance on his finger, then tipped it forward. It fluttered to the floor with no sound, no resistance. He picked it up again and placed it gently on the table nearby. It looked out of place there. He left it anyway. He turned the loop of twine between his fingers, feeling the coarse texture. It had once held something shut, or maybe together. He considered unraveling it, but changed his mind. Some knots weren't meant to be undone. He placed it back into the bowl, beside the button. The button was dark, carved from wood, smoothed around the edges. He remembered where it had come from, a coat lost to time and rain. He pressed it into his palm and held it there for a moment, letting the weight, barely noticeable, remind him of how many things could vanish and still leave behind a shape. The pebble was small, oval, cold. He didn't know where he had found it, but it had never left the bowl since. He touched it once, then twice, then set it aside and closed his eyes for a moment. Not from weariness, just to hold the quiet more fully. The fire behind him gave a soft sigh, a crack of heat stretching through the last pieces of wood. Elias opened his eyes and turned to glance at the hearth.
The light danced on the walls, small, slow shadows moving without destination.
The kind of movement that meant nothing and everything. He looked at the feather on the table, then back at the bowl. He thought of placing it back inside, then thought of leaving it where it lay. In the end, he did neither. He just watched. Elias sat quietly for a time, the feather still resting on the table, the bowl beside him. Without meaning to, he nudged the table's edge with his knee. It was barely a touch, but enough. The button rolled. It spun with a soft tapping rhythm, slow at first, then faster, circling once, twice, and veering toward the floor. It fell, not with drama, but with a gentle clack against the boards. He leaned sideways and watched it continue rolling, moving just far enough to rest against the leg of the chair across from him. He stared at it for a while. It wasn't out of reach, but it wasn't exactly close either. He didn't move right away. There was something satisfying about watching it rest there, stopped by something still. Eventually he reached for it, not bending at the waist, but sliding forward with care, a motion he'd made hundreds of times in his life. The button was cool to the touch. He picked it up, turned it over, then placed it in the center of his palm. It sat there like it had a purpose, like it was waiting for something he wouldn't ask it to do. He stood, slowly, the way people do when there's no reason to rush. He walked back to the bowl and dropped the button in with the faintest of clicks. The feather remained on the table. He let it be. He looked toward the window, where the light had shifted again. Afternoon was arriving. Quiet, slow, without a single sign.
Used light changing.
Just air warming slightly where it passed the glass. He ran his hand along the edge of the table. The surface was smooth from years of use. Meals, maps, writing, resting. A mark near the far corner had never been sanded out. He had thought of fixing it once.
Then thought better of it.
Not everything required smoothing. He sat again, not in the chair he had left, but the one opposite. The view was slightly different, the hearth from another angle, the table from a new edge, the bowl now facing him. He folded his hands in his lap and simply looked at the world as if it were unfamiliar. And for a moment, it was. As Elias sat in the new chair, he felt a small shift beneath him, a quiet movement of wood on wood. He looked down and pressed gently against the leg. It gave a little, not wobbly, just soft in its hold. A peg had loosened over time. He had noticed before, many times. It was the kind of repair that never felt urgent. The chair still held. He leaned forward and pressed the leg again, curious if the give had worsened. It hadn't. He placed his palm on the seat beside him, feeling the warmth the sun had left there earlier. The grain of the wood ran in long, straight lines, interrupted only by a single knot that looked like an eye. He had sat in this chair during storms, during meals, during days when he had nothing to say. He had once read letters in this chair, though he no longer kept them. He couldn't remember where they'd gone. He shifted his weight again, the chair responding with a soft creak. The sound reminded him of something, but the thought didn't finish. It drifted away before it formed. He looked at the peg. A small round nub of darker wood, barely visible. He ran his thumb over it. It felt smooth, almost polished from years of touch. He thought about fetching the mallet, tapping it back into place. He imagined the sound, not loud, but definite. He imagined standing to get it, but didn't. Instead, he leaned back and folded his arms, letting the weight of his body settle evenly. He could feel the shift, the slight imbalance beneath him. The peg held. Not perfectly, but enough. He turned his head slowly, glancing toward the hearth. A small flame had returned, somehow, perhaps from a buried ember that refused to fade. He hadn't fed it, and yet there it was. He watched it for a while, the way one watches a single leaf fall or a crack form in ice. A change too slow to name, but real. Then he looked at the peg again. It hadn't moved, but he pressed it once more, just to be sure. As the afternoon light grew softer, Elias reached to the corner shelf above the hearth and removed a small iron lantern. Its frame was square, the glass cloudy with years of soot and fingerprints. He held it by the handle, letting it swing slightly as he lowered it to the table. He opened the tiny hinged door and looked inside. The candle stub inside had burned down nearly to nothing, wax melted into odd shapes along the base. He tilted the lantern slightly, and the wax shifted with a soft scrape. He didn't remove it. He simply watched how it moved. He reached into the drawer beneath the shelf and found another candle. Longer, slightly bent, with a thin crack down the side. It fit the holder, barely. He placed it inside, then struck the flint beside the hearth, sending a spark into the wick.
Nothing code.
He struck again.
Still nothing.
He examined the wick. It was whole, not damp, just uncooperative. He didn't force it. He closed the door gently and returned the lantern to the table. A lantern that didn't light was still a lantern. It still held the idea of flame. He sat back down and looked at it. The cloudy glass, the faint outline of the candle inside, the hinge that stuck a little every time. He had used it once to light his way to the well. Another time when a storm had knocked the chimney's breath sideways. But today it would stay dark. The room didn't need more light. The window still held enough of the sky. Enough to cast gentle shadows and turn the dust golden. He let the lantern be. He ran his finger across the table, following an invisible line, not drawing, not planning, just following. The lantern cast no glow, but its weight was enough. It stayed where it was placed. Elias stood and walked to the small cabinet beneath the shelf, a piece of furniture he had built himself, once, from pine too soft for flooring. It had one drawer, shallow,
Slightly crooked.
It stuck every time it opened. He pulled it slowly. It resisted, then gave in, sliding out with a dry wooden groan. Inside, a collection of nothings. A few acorns. A folded piece of cloth with no clear purpose. A nail wrapped in twine. An old pipe he didn't use. A black stone with a white streak through its middle. All resting together like memories stored for someone who would never ask about them. He picked up the acorns one at a time. Smooth.
Dry. Some split slightly down one side.
He rubbed one between his palms. The shape reminded him of autumn, though it had been years since he'd walked beneath trees dropping them. He placed them back in a neat row, side by side, though they did not need arranging. The cloth was frayed. A corner torn. He unfolded it halfway, then stopped. He didn't remember what it had been used for. Perhaps it had wiped a handle. Perhaps it had wrapped a small gift once. He folded it again, just as uncertain, and set it down. He lifted the black stone and turned it in his hand. It was heavy for its size. The white line across its surface looked like a horizon, or a crack. He placed it on the table beside the lantern, just to change the way the light touched it. Then returned it to the drawer. The nail wrapped in twine made a small tink when he lifted it. The twine had stiffened, and he didn't try to unwind it. He held it like a sealed thought, then let it go. He slid the drawer shut again, slower than before, until it clicked into stillness. Not closed perfectly, but enough. The kind of closure that didn't require precision. He rested his hand on top of the cabinet for a moment. The wood was cool. His palm fit the space naturally. Then he turned away and returned to the chair that leaned just slightly left. In the corner beside the door sat a small wicker basket. The handle was bent slightly to one side, a flaw formed not by accident, but by time. Elias had made the basket himself, years ago, when the winters were longer and he still liked to work with his hands in the dark hours. He lifted it by the handle and felt it flex beneath the weight of nothing. The basket was empty, but it carried the memory of apples, potatoes, a loaf or two of bread, sometimes feathers. He placed it on the table and turned it slowly, watching how the light slid over its curves. The weaving was uneven. A few ends stuck out where they shouldn't. He had never trimmed them. He liked seeing the imperfections. They reminded him that it was finished by choice, not by mastery. He traced the handle with one finger, stopping where it leaned left. He bent it gently, knowing it would return the moment he let go. He let go. It returned. He reached for the cloth he had folded earlier, the one with a red stain, and placed it inside the basket, smoothing it over the bottom as if preparing it to carry something delicate. Then, without thinking, he added the acorns from the drawer. One by one, they made a dry, soft sound as they landed. Round, hollow, satisfying. He placed only 5, though there had been more. 5 felt like enough. He lifted the basket again and held it against his side, walking toward the window where the sunlight had begun to fade just slightly. He looked out, the basket in one hand, his other resting on the sill. Outside, the grass moved slowly, not in waves, just in small gestures, like someone nodding in a conversation they didn't need to join. He thought, briefly, of carrying the basket down to the stream.
For no reason.
Just to see how it would feel in his hand again. But instead, he set it down beside the door. Not where it had been. A little closer to the fire. A little closer to the now. Radio button blocked 26 of 40. The floorboard that shifted. As Elias stepped back toward the hearth, one of the floorboards let out a low, tired groan beneath his foot, a sound he knew well. It was the third board from the wall, just to the right of the fire. It had always moved slightly, even when the rest of the house stood firm. He lifted his foot and pressed again. The board flexed downward, then rose, not quite back to where it started. He crouched beside it, running his hand along the edge, where the plank met its neighbor. Dust had gathered in the small space between them, the kind of dust that settled quietly, only noticed by those who bent down to see it. He blew gently, and the dust shifted, rising in a small cloud before vanishing into the air. He didn't wipe it away. He just watched. The gap revealed something, a small fragment of string, wedged between the boards. He reached for it slowly and pulled it free. It was short, frayed at both ends, and faded to a soft gray. He rolled it between his fingers, trying to remember where it had come from. He couldn't. He placed it beside him on the floor, then tapped the board again.
The same creak.
The same complaint. He considered pulling the board up. He had tools, after all. But then he imagined the room with that gap widened, the floor torn, the symmetry disturbed. It didn't seem worth it. The creak was part of the room's language now. A small voice, calling only when stepped on. He sat cross-legged beside the board, holding the piece of string in one hand. He tied it into a loose knot. No reason, just motion. Then untied it. Then tied it again. Behind him, the fire gave a long breath and shifted its weight. A coal collapsed inward. The scent of smoke deepened. Elias turned his head slightly to listen. Then he placed the string on the stone hearth, just beside the iron kettle.
A place of pause.
Not permanent.
Used for now.
He pressed the board once more with his palm. It moved. He nodded once. It would continue doing that. And that was enough. Candle block 28 of 40. The wick that wouldn't catch. Elias opened his eyes again, slowly, and reached for the small candle on the mantel. Not the stub in the lantern, but a newer one, tall and unused. He set it on the table and picked up the fire striker from the hearth. He tried once.
No flam.
He adjusted the wick, trimming it with his thumbnail. Another try. A brief flicker.
Then nothing.
He looked at the wick again. White. Clean. Quiet. He struck the flint again. This time, a spark caught. A whisper of flame, dancing just above the wax, small and shy. He watched it grow, watched the black thread begin to curl in the center, watched the wax soften ever so slightly around the base. The candle stood perfectly still. The flame did not move unless he breathed too close. So he held his breath. He placed the striker back in its niche and sat in the chair with the loose peg again, careful not to lean. The candle's light was soft, orange, barely present in the room. But it was there. He leaned forward and placed his hand near the flame, not to touch it, but to feel the heat hover above his skin. It was faint, but it reached him. The candle made no sound, no scent, no shadow strong enough to matter. But it changed the way the room felt.
Slightly warmer.
Slightly more alive. He turned his hand palm up in front of it. The flame stretched, then settled. He let it burn. Not because he needed the light. Not because he needed the warmth. Just because it was something he had made happen. With the candle burning steadily on the table, Elias stood and walked toward the small drawer beneath the shelf. Inside, among folded cloths and an unused strip of beeswax, lay a single wooden spoon. He had carved it himself from a branch of maple, long before the basket, back when his hands had more curiosity than pain. The handle was slightly twisted.
The ball of the spoon toed upon one side.
It wasn't beautiful, but it was honest. He picked it up slowly and turned it in both hands. His thumbs traced the grain, following the light lines like rivers across a map. The wood had darkened over time, stained not by food, but by air, light, the slow press of years. It had never stirred soup, never touched broth. It had only been made, then kept. He set it on the table beside the candle and sat down once more. The spoon cast a narrow shadow, curved and soft, like a smile someone had forgotten they were making. Elias rested his elbows on the table and looked at it. Not for meaning, not for memory, but because it was something real in a world that sometimes felt like fog. He remembered the tree it came from. It had grown behind the first cabin, the one lost to rot and termites and one long winter. The branch had fallen after a storm, not broken, just surrendered. He had stripped the bark with care, carved slowly by firelight with a dull knife and patience. He turned the spoon over now, noticing a small crack forming at the base of the handle. It wasn't dangerous, not yet, but it was the kind of thing that widened without asking. He pressed his thumb there and held it still, as if stillness could stop the splitting. He considered sanding it, oiling it, maybe even using it once, just once, to stir something simple. But he knew he wouldn't. Some things were made to sit quietly, to exist without purpose, like an unopened letter, or an empty jar, or a day like this. The candle beside it flickered slightly, a whisper of breath in the room. Elias leaned forward and moved the spoon half an inch to the left. The shadow changed shape, lengthened, then settled again. That seemed better. He wasn't sure why. It just did. He stood again and reached for the folded cloths on the shelf. He picked one, plain, off-white, thin at the corners, and wrapped the spoon gently inside. Not tightly, just enough. He placed the bundle back into the drawer, resting it on top of the wax and the other quiet things that didn't ask to be remembered. Then he closed the drawer with both hands. Slowly, deliberately. and the room exhaled with him. Elias stood in the center of the room, letting the warmth of the candle and the faint heat of the hearth wash quietly over him. His eyes drifted down to the large flat stone set into the floor in front of the fire, the hearthstone. He'd stood on it 1,000 times, maybe more. It was smooth, gray, and carried a long, thin crack that ran from one corner to the other, like a scar with no story. He knelt slowly, letting one knee rest against the edge of the stone. The crack hadn't widened in years. It had simply appeared one spring, long ago, after a stretch of bitter cold. He remembered noticing it for the first time, barefoot, early in the morning, feeling the shift beneath him. It had made no sound, just a silent decision to become what it was. His fingers traced the line now, gently, moving along the faint groove where dust sometimes gathered. The stone was cool beneath his touch, even so near the fire. It never fully warmed. It absorbed heat without reacting, like it was there to balance the room, not to take part in it. There was a slight discoloration near the center of the crack, where ashes had fallen year after year. He licked his thumb and rubbed the mark. It faded, but didn't vanish. He smiled softly, or something close to it. Some marks were meant to stay, not to remind but to exist. To the right of the crack, a small chip had formed along the edge. Nothing sharp, just a missing piece. He leaned closer, squinting slightly, though there was nothing to read in it. No message. Just another place where something had changed. He picked up a tiny pebble nearby and placed it in the chip, watching how it fit. It didn't. But he left it there anyway. He sat back, cross-legged now, and rested his hands in his lap. The fire gave a low pop, and a spark fell harmlessly behind the grate. He watched it die in silence. Elias looked around the room, the table with the candle, the chair with the loose peg, the spoon drawer now resting closed. Each thing was in its place, each thing still. He returned his eyes to the hearthstone. The crack was just visible in the flickering light. A part of the house, like the window that didn't close fully or the latch that always clicked twice. Not broken, just changed. He stood again, slowly, with the careful motion of someone who's learned not to rush bones. One hand brushed the front of his coat. The other rested briefly on the edge of the mantel. Then he turned toward the door, not to leave, but just to know it was still there. Elias turned slowly from the hearth, his eyes drawn to the cabin door, specifically to the narrow strip of wood that framed it on the left side. Near the top, just above eye level, protruded a single iron nail, not driven fully in.
Not holding anything. Just there.
It had been there since he moved in, maybe longer. He had noticed it the first week, thought about pulling it out, but never did.
It anterastid.
It hadn't loosened. It had simply stayed.
Waiting without purpose. A silent observer of entrances and exits.
He stepped closer, the floor whispering beneath his boots, and tilted his head to examine it. The nail was crooked, angled slightly upward, as though it had once held something hung in haste. A lantern?
A string?
A coat? He didn't know. The wood around it bore no markings, no indentation, only time. He reached up with one finger and tapped the nail gently.
It made no sound.
He tapped again.
Still nothing.
He pressed on it lightly, just enough to feel its refusal. It was steady.
Unmoving. Anchored in forgotten intent.
Elias lowered his hand and looked down at the floor. A bit of dust had gathered in the corner where the frame met the wall. He crouched, brushed it away with his sleeve, and then stayed there, in that pose of half-rising thought, not quite moving, not quite still. He looked up again at the nail and imagined placing something on it.
A note, maybe.
A scrap of cloth.
Something light, something pointless.
But he had nothing like that now. He pressed his thumb against the nail one last time, then stood. He turned his back to the door and sat on the stool beside it. It creaked slightly under his weight, a different sound than the chair or the bench. This creak was higher, tighter, like a question unanswered. He let it pass. From the stool, he could see the whole cabin in one glance. Table, hearth, bed, shelves. Shadows stretching from corners like long fingers not trying to reach anything. The candle still flickered, the flame leaning slightly to the left, reacting to a draft too gentle to feel. Elias folded his hands in his lap and looked at the door frame again. The nail hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. But somehow, it looked more certain now. As if, by being noticed, it had regained a kind of purpose. He smiled, barely, not with amusement, but with recognition. Not everything had to be useful to be worth keeping. As the light began to bend toward the long end of afternoon, Elias rose from the stool and walked toward the cabin door. He didn't open it yet, just rested his hand against the wood, feeling the grain under his palm. It was smooth from use, but dry, like paper that had been folded too many times. The latch clicked softly as he lifted it, and the door opened on a slow, practiced arc. Outside, the sun was lower now, cutting long slants of golden light through the trees. The clearing stretched quiet and still.
The coop. De wod pile. De nero utra il curlin of tauar de estream.
But what drew Elias's eye was the flat stone that sat just beside the front step. Not on the path, not part of it, just beside. He had never moved it, had stepped over it 100, 1,000 times. But today he noticed it with new weight. It was oval, wide, the color of clay. A natural seat, if one needed it. A low shelf for boots. A place for nothing. He stepped down and stood over it, hands in his coat pockets. The stone was flush with the soil, but not buried. Moss had begun to creep up one side, a green lace spreading like quiet thought. He crouched beside it and ran a finger along the moss, which was cold and slightly damp, but soft, like hair left out in the rain. He sat on the step beside the stone, elbows on knees, and simply looked at it. The surface held shallow grooves, maybe from animals, maybe from weather, maybe both. A leaf had landed there, crisp, brown, withered at the edges. He didn't brush it away. He liked it where it was. The wind passed again, just one slow breath that tugged at his sleeve, then vanished.
A branch creaked far off, answering nothing.
A sparrow sang a note and stopped. Elias let the quiet return. He leaned forward, removed a glove from one hand, and placed his bare palm on the stone. It was colder than he expected. It didn't give, didn't change, didn't ask for anything. It just was. He removed the leaf after all, holding it by the stem. It cracked once in his fingers, dry and delicate. He set it on his thigh, then forgot it was there. Looking at the stone again, he whispered something. Not a word, not a sentence.
Just a sound. A touk tal fexaled.
And the stone held it. Or didn't. When he stood again, he didn't brush the moss. He didn't replace the leaf. He stepped back up to the threshold, paused, and looked one last time. Then he closed the door gently, like the last page of a book no one would finish. Back inside the cabin, Elias turned toward a narrow shelf that held what might have once been a clock. It sat there like a reminder, not of time itself, but of the idea of time. Its face faded, its hands stopped at something like 4:17. It hadn't moved since the spring before last. He walked over and stood in front of it, arms crossed behind his back, as though paying respects. The glass over the face was cracked, a clean line from corner to corner. He reached forward and touched it lightly with the tip of one finger. The crack didn't deepen. The dust didn't stir. It wasn't a large clock, just a wooden frame, square with rounded corners. A gift, he thought, though he couldn't remember from whom. Or maybe he'd picked it up at the last town gathering, traded for firewood or eggs. It didn't matter anymore. It had lived here long enough to be permanent. Elias slid the clock slightly to the left on the shelf, only a few inches, just to see how the light changed across the surface. It wasn't better. But it was different, so he left it. He opened the tiny back panel and looked inside. The gears were still there, frozen in their places, a complex arrangement of once purposeful metal. He had oiled them once, long ago.
Maybe twice.
But eventually, the ticking had stopped. Not suddenly, just eventually.
Like most things though.
He considered winding it. The key still hung nearby, tied to the shelf with a loop of thin leather. He touched the key, turned it gently between his fingers, but didn't lift it. He had tried before. The gears only groaned now. Better to let them rest. He closed the back, heard the faintest click, and stepped back once more. The hand still pointed to that same time, as if it were waiting for him to remember something specific about that hour. He didn't. Elias walked to the window and looked out at the shadows stretching across the clearing. The day had moved on without the clock. It always did. The world didn't wait for machinery. He returned to the shelf and ran one hand along the top edge of the frame. It was coated in soft dust. He didn't clean it.
The dust belonged.
The clock had earned it. Sitting back in his chair, he looked across the room at the still object. Even broken, even silent, it made him feel more grounded. The absence of ticking made the quiet feel more deliberate. Not an accident, a choice. And for now, that was enough. After sitting in the chair for some time, Elias stood and walked toward the small chest near the foot of the bed. It was short, wide, and scarred from years of use. The hinges groaned faintly as he opened it, lifting the lid with both hands. Inside, a neat stack of folded linens and old clothing waited in silent order. He didn't need anything from it, but he looked anyway. He ran his hand over the top layer, a worn shirt, 2 folded trousers, and a single woolen sock with a rolled edge. The sock was brown, patched at the heel, and soft from countless washes. He lifted it, held it up, then looked underneath. No second sock. He checked again, just to be sure.
Still nothing.
Only one. He smiled faintly, a slow curve in one corner of his mouth. The other sock had been missing for months, maybe longer. He had looked for it once or twice.
Beneath the bed. Behind the bench.
In the basket with old cloth. It had never turned up. At some point, the searching had become less important than the absence itself. He sat on the edge of the bed, sock in hand, and turned it over slowly. The patch had held up well, stitched in tight loops with thread slightly lighter than the original wool. He didn't remember mending it. Perhaps it had been someone else, or a version of himself from a different season. He placed the sock on his knee and looked at it like one might regard an old letter, familiar but unread. It was no longer about warmth. It was about memory, about use, about still being here. He reached over to the small table by the bed and picked up a piece of twine. He tied the sock loosely at the opening, making a soft pouch. Not for storage, just to give it form. Then he untied it. Then tied it again, this time with a gentler knot. He stood and placed the sock back in the chest, right on top of the folded shirt, deliberately centered. Then lowered the lid slowly, allowing the hinges to groan their quiet complaint. The sound, like everything else in the room, had become part of the rhythm. He stood still for a moment, hands resting on the chest, eyes on the floorboard where the sock had once been found, rolled under the bed one spring morning after a long rain. He had picked it up damp, squeezed it once, and left it to dry by the fire. That was years ago. Or maybe not. He looked once more at the chest, then turned back to the chair by the fire. The flame had dwindled again, not out, but low. He didn't feed it. He let it speak in whispers. As Elias settled back into his chair by the fire, he noticed the wall beside him had changed. Not in color or shape, but in the way the light moved across it. The candle still burned quietly on the table, but its flame had shifted, perhaps from a breath of wind through a crack in the wall, perhaps from its own rhythm. The result was a slow, flickering dance of shadows. One shadow in particular caught his eye, a long, soft form stretching from the leg of the table up toward the shelf. It wasn't dramatic, but it moved just enough to draw attention. Elias watched it sway, then pause, then sway again. There was no pattern, no music, just motion. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hands folded. His eyes stayed on the wall. He imagined what the shadow looked like to someone who didn't know the room. A blade? A branch? A figure? It was none of these. It was only light, interrupted by an object, drawn in silence.
The texture of the wooden wall gap desadou strange angles.
The grain bent it. The knots in the boards broke it. At one point, it looked like the shadow had a hinge or a split, as if the wall were folding itself in slow motion. Elias didn't blink for a while. The flame twitched again, and the shadow snapped wider, then narrowed. He found this comforting, that something in the room was alive in its own quiet way. He lifted a hand and reached toward the wall. His fingers cast their own form, blurred and soft beside the longer shadow. He moved them slowly, like he might start a puppet show for no one. The shadow of his hand swam in and out of the shape already there. He let it pass. A log in the hearth gave a soft crack. The sound brought him back, but not urgently. He let his hand fall back to his lap. He looked up toward the top shelf.
Dust floated gently through the candlelight.
The shadow reached nearly that high, stretching farther now as the flame leaned low. The angle of the sun outside was gone.
Only the candle mattered now.
He sat back in his chair and let his eyes close, just briefly. He could still see the flicker behind his eyelids, still feel the presence of movement without needing to see it. He opened them again and looked once more at the wall. The shadow had shifted, slightly, enough to know it had not stopped. Elias turned his head toward the back window, the smaller one near the bed, where the light had mostly faded. It had no shutter, just a simple latch, slightly bent and rusted, that had never fully closed. He had tried to fix it once, years ago, with a thin file and some patience. But the wood had warped, and the hook never met the loop quite right again. So it became decorative, a symbol of security rather than the thing itself. He stood from the chair, moved across the room, and crouched beside the window, careful not to touch the glass. Instead, he touched the latch. It was cold, rough with rust, and moved just enough to make a faint metallic squeak. The sound was familiar, almost friendly. He lifted it, let it fall, lifted it again.
Let it fall again.
The repetition made no difference to the latch, but it helped Elias feel like he had participated in its failure. Outside, the clearing was dusky and soft, wrapped in the final colors of day. Nothing moved. Not the grass, not the trees, not even the smoke from the chimney, which had thinned into nothingness. The world outside the window was silent, still, like a painting that breathed, just once every hour. He pressed his forehead gently against the frame, not hard, just enough to feel the chill of the wood. It steadied him, or maybe he steadied it. The two had been leaning into each other for years. He opened the window slightly, just enough to let the air in. It entered like a guest who had been standing at the door all day, waiting to be noticed.
A breeze, barely there, touched his cheek.
It carried the scent of leaves cooling in the dark, of dry earth, of cold wood. The window creaked softly in its frame. The latch hung limp to the side, ignored and indifferent. Elias smiled, not from joy, but from familiarity. There was a strange peace in things that no longer promised anything. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, knees drawn up loosely. From this angle, the latch looked like a crooked finger pointing downward.
Accusing nothing.
Indicating no direction.
Just hanging.
He stayed there for a while. Long enough to forget why he'd gotten up. Long enough for the air to change again, slightly warmer, then cooler, then gone. He reached up, pressed the latch into place again, even though it didn't hold. It bounced back, naturally. He nodded once. That too had its rhythm. Then he stood, brushing the back of his trousers with both hands, and stepped away. The window creaked once more behind him, as if to say, "Still here." The candle on the table had grown shorter. Elias noticed it as he stepped back across the room, his boots whispering against the uneven floor. The wax had pooled around its base in a quiet ring, a soft skirt frozen in mid-melt. The flame was smaller now, steadier, as if it had matured through the act of burning. He pulled the chair a little closer to the table and sat, resting his hands flat on the wood. He didn't touch the candle, he rarely did. He simply looked at it, the same way one might look at someone speaking in a language they couldn't quite understand but enjoyed listening to anyway. The flame flickered slightly, then righted itself, still golden, still whole. Elias leaned forward and exhaled near it, slowly, just to see what it would do. It bent gently, then sprang back, like a reed in a shallow stream. He watched it recover. That part always fascinated him, the way something so fragile could be so certain. The wax near the base had begun to crack, forming a line down the side. It would break soon, probably spill. He reached for a small saucer, not the one for meals, but the one used only for this, and slid it beneath the candle. It scraped faintly as it moved. The sound didn't echo. It simply filled the space between moments. He sat back again, his hands still resting near the flame but not touching. The heat was faint, distant, like the last warmth in a coat taken from a hook. He looked at the remaining length of the candle. Barely an inch now. Enough to last a while. Or not. He looked toward the window. Night was forming in layers, not descending all at once. The clearing had disappeared, replaced by the blur of tree shapes and the long suggestion of a sky that would soon be entirely black. One bird called, then stopped. Back at the table, Elias picked up the small knife he used only for trimming wicks. It lay beside the bowl, unused for days. He turned it in his hand, testing its balance, then set it down again. No trimming was needed. The flame was fine as it was. Perfect, even in its gentle impermanence. He watched a single bead of wax form near the edge and drop with soft finality into the saucer. One motion. One sound.
Then nothing again.
Elias folded his hands on the table, leaned forward slightly, and let his breathing match the rhythm of the flicker. Soon, the candle would go out. But not yet. As the candle whispered in its final stretch, Elias rose from the chair and walked slowly toward the bed. The mattress, if it could still be called that, was a flattened sack of straw bound in ticking and memories. It creaked when he pressed one hand to it, not from discomfort, but from its agreement with age. He didn't sit. Not yet. Instead, he knelt beside the bed frame and looked beneath. There was a hollow space there, no more than a foot high, where dust, wood shavings, and time had collected like fog in a forgotten corner. It wasn't dark, only shadowed, and Elias knew every object beneath it, though there were only 3.
The first, a small wooden box with no lid.
It had once held nails, then feathers, then nothing. Now it simply held the shape of usefulness. He reached for it, slid it forward, and looked inside. A twig, a sliver of bark, one folded scrap of cloth. The cloth had a thread still caught in the grain. He did not unfold it. The second object, a pair of worn leather insoles, curled at the edges like dried leaves. He had removed them from his boots 2 winters ago and never replaced them. They had shaped themselves to his feet over the years and now held only the ghost of that shape. He ran a finger along the arch of one, then set it down exactly as it had been. The third, a stone, round and perfectly dull. He didn't remember placing it there. He had never moved it, but it had never moved itself either. It remained, like a punctuation mark that had outlived the sentence. He nodded toward it, just once.
Then, slowly, he placed the open box back beneath the bed, used where the shadow met the light.
The insoles followed. Then his hand, pausing only briefly on the edge of the floorboard before pulling back. He remained kneeling for a moment longer, then rose. The bed didn't invite him. It merely accepted him. Elias sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees. The candle was nearly done, a pale nub of wax swaying in a barely there breeze. He did not blow it out. He simply watched. The room was quiet now in a deeper way. Not the quiet of absence, but of completion. The kind of quiet that happens when nothing else needs to arrive. The fire had turned to coal, red at the center, gray along the sides. The air smelled of soot and wool and earth. He removed his coat and folded it slowly, smoothing the arms across his lap before laying it across the foot of the bed. His fingers paused on the fabric, then let go. He reached for the blanket, a thick woolen thing with 3 stitched repairs and one corner darker than the rest. It had weight. He liked that. Some things, when held, reminded you were real. Before lying down, he sat for a while longer. The bed gave slightly beneath him. The silence pressed in again, but gently. He inhaled through his nose, held the air for a moment, then released it as if letting go of a season.
Nothing left todo. Nothing worth starting.
He turned toward the candle once more. It leaned now, melting from its side, no longer proud. The flame was uneven. It flickered inward, as if retreating into itself. He didn't speak to it, but he watched it like one watches a departing guest, not out of sadness, but of shared understanding. Then he laid down, one hand above the blanket, one beneath it. His head touched the straw-filled cushion without sound. The ceiling watched him back. Its beams, familiar and flawed, greeted him like old wood should, without pretense.
Without charm.
He closed his eyes, but not to sleep. Not yet. Somewhere above him, a beam shifted. Not a snap. Not a groan. Just a slight movement, like the wood had breathed once and then settled again. Elias opened his eyes, but didn't move. The sound was one he had heard before. In storms.
In deep winter. In absolute stillness.
It was the sound of the house remembering its shape. He stared upward, following the line where one beam met another. There, in the corner, a small cobweb fluttered gently. Not from wind, but from something else.
Maybe memory.
Maybe gravity. He traced it with his eyes. The thread curved upward, then down, then disappeared behind a nail. It held nothing. No spider. No dust.
Just tension.
Elias remained still, listening. The air around him seemed to slow. Even his breath began to match the house. Shallow, patient, unhurried. The kind of breathing that one doesn't notice until it's gone. The chair creaked faintly, not from movement, just from wood giving back what it had taken.
A quinto fecho. A soft replaito nothing.
He didn't blink, not for a long while. His hand, resting atop the blanket, shifted once, as if to say something, then changed its mind. The candle gave its final flicker, a sigh of smoke.
A curl of darkness. Then, nothing.
The room welcomed it. There was no more light, but the dark wasn't heavy. It simply filled in the spaces where things had once glowed.
The window gave no stars.
The moon had gone elsewhere. The clearing outside had ceased to be. Inside the cabin, Elias lay still.
Not asleep, not awake, just present.
One heartbeat at a time. The room breathed with him. The walls expanded and contracted so subtly that only the old boards noticed. The air moved in small circles, wrapping around his boots, then rising toward the shelves, then folding into the ceiling's long-held silence. The fire was ash now. Not cold, but complete. What warmth remained had taken root in the stones, in the blanket, in the wooden chair that watched over him like a quiet sentry. He did not shift. He did not stretch. He was not waiting. He had seen everything the day had offered.
Touched every object that cayet to be touched.
Listened to wood, to wind, to himself. Nothing had changed. Nothing needed to. In the morning, he might reach for the latch again. Or not. He might light another candle. Or sit by the stream.
Or move the spoon one more time.
Or leave it where it lay. But that was not now. Now was only this. A man in a bed, in a house, in a forest that didn't ask questions. Now was breath. Now was shadow. Now was still. And that was enough.